Hey everybody, it's Poppy Grave. I'm here with another bedtime story, so snuggle up, get comfy, and just relax to the sound of my voice. The story is called The Golden Touch. Once upon a time, there lived a very rich man and a king besides, whose name was Midas, and he had a little daughter who nobody but himself ever heard of, and whose name I either never knew or have entirely forgotten. So, because I love odd names for little girls, I chose to call her Marigold. This King Midas was a founder of gold, than of anything else in the world. He valued his royal crown chiefly because it was composed of the precious metal. If he loved anything better, or half so well, it was that the one little maiden who played so merrily around her father's footstool. But the more Midas loved his daughter, the more did he desire and seek for wealth. He thought, foolish man, that the best thing he could possibly do for his dear child would be to bequeath her the immense pile of yellow, glistening coin that had ever been heaped together since the world was made. Thus, he gave all his thoughts and 47 of all his time to this one purpose. If he ever happened to gaze for an instant at the gold-tinted clouds at the sunset, he wished that they were real gold, and that they could be squeezed safely into a strong box. When little Marigold ran to meet him with a bunch of buttercups and dandelions, he used to say, "Poor, poor child, if these flowers were as golden as they look, they would be worth the plucking." And yet, in his earlier days, before he was so entirely possessed of this insane desires for riches, King Midas has shown a great taste for flowers. He had planted a garden in which grew the biggest and most beautifulest and sweetest roses that any mortal ever saw or smelled. These roses were still growing in the garden, as large, as lovely, and as fragrant as when Midas used to pass whole hours gazing at them and inhaling their perfume. But now, if he looked at it all, it was only to calculate how much the garden would be worth if each of the innumerable rose petals were a thin plate of gold. And though he is once fond of music, in spite of an idle story about his ears, which were said to remember those of an ass, the only music for poor Midas now was the chink of one coin against another. At length, as people always grew more and more foolish, unless they take care to grow wiser and wiser, Midas had got to be exceedingly unreasonable, that he could sincerely bear to see or touch any object that was not gold. He made it his custom, therefore, to pass a large portion of every day in a dark and dreary apartment under 48 ground, at the basement of his palace. It was here that he kept his wealth. To his dismal hole, for it was a little better than a dungeon, Midas betook himself whenever he wanted to be particularly happy. Here, after carefully locking the door, he would take a bag of gold coin, or a gold cup as big as a washbowl, or a heavy golden bar, or a peck measure of gold dust, and bring them from the obscure corners of the room into the one bright narrow sunbeam that fell from the dungeon-like window. He valued the sunbeam for no other reason but that his treasure would not shine without its help. And then would he reckon over the coins in the bag, toss up the bar, catch it as it came down, shift the gold dust through his fingers, and look at the funny image of his own face as it reflected in the burnished circumference of the cup, and whisper to himself, "O Midas, rich King Midas, what a happy man art thou!" But it was laughable to see how the image of his face kept grinning at him out of the polished surface of the cup. It seemed to be aware of his foolish behavior and to have a naughty inclination to make fun of him. Midas called himself a happy man, but felt that he was not quite yet so happy as he might be. The very tiptoe of enjoyment would never be reached unless the whole world were to become his treasure room and be filled with yellow metal, which should be all his own. Now, I need hardly remind such wise little people as you are that in the old times, when King Midas was alive, a great many things came to pass, which we should consider wonderful if they were to happen in our own day and country. And on the other hand, a great many things take place nowadays, which seem not only wonderful to us, but at which the people of old times would have stared their eyes out. On the whole, I regard our own times as the strangest of the two, but, however that may be, I must go on with my story. Midas was enjoying himself in his treasure room one day, as usual, when he perceived a shadow fall over the heaps of gold, and, looking suddenly up, what should be behold but the figure of a stranger standing in the bright and narrow sunbeam. It was a young man, with a cheerful and ruddy face. Whether it was the imagination of King Midas threw a yellow tinge over everything, or whatever the cause might be, he could not help fancying that smile which the stranger regarded him as a kind of golden radiance. Certainly, although his figure intercepted the sunshine, there was now a brighter gleam upon all the pile of treasures than before. Even the remotest corners had their share of it, and were lighted up, when the stranger smiled, as with tips of flames and sparkles of fire. As Midas knew that he had carefully turned the key in the lock, and no mortal strength could possibly break into his treasure room, he, of course, concluded that his visitor must be something more than mortal. It is no matter what telling you who he was. In those days, when Earth was comparatively a new affair, it was supposed to be often the resort of beings endowed with supernatural power, and whose interest themselves in the joys and sorrows of men, women, and children, half playfully and half seriously. Midas had met such beings before now, and was not sorry to meet one of them again. The stranger's aspect indeed was so good-humored and kindly, if not beneficial, that it would have been unreasonable to suspect him of intending any mischief. It was far more probable that he came to do Midas a favor, and what could that favor be, unless to multiply his heaps of treasure? "You are a wealthy man, friend Midas," he observed. "I doubt whether any other four walls on earth can contain so much gold as you contrived to pile up in this room." "I have done pretty well," answered Midas, in a discontented tone. "But, after all, it is but a trifle, when you consider that it was taking me my whole life to get together. If one could live 1,000 years, he might have time to grow rich." "What?" exclaimed the stranger. "Then you are not satisfied?" Midas shook his head. "And pray what would satisfy you?" asked the stranger. "Merely for the curiosity of the thing, I shall be glad to know." Midas paused and meditated. He felt a presentiment to the stranger that such a golden lustre in his gold-humored smile had come hither with both the power and the purpose of gratifying his utmost wishes. Now, therefore, was the fortunate moment when he had but to speak, and obtain whatever possible or seemingly impossible thing it might come into his head, he asked. So he thought, and thought, and thought, and heaped up one golden mountain upon another in his imagination, without being able to imagine them big enough. At last, a bright idea occurred to King Midas. It seemed really as bright as the glistening metal which he loved so much. Raising his head, he looked the lustrous stranger in the face. Well, Midas, observed his visitor, I see that you have a length hit upon something that will satisfy you. Tell me your wish. It is only this, replied Midas. I am weary of collecting my treasures with so much trouble, and beholding the heap, so thereafter I have done my best. I wish everything that I touch to be changed to gold. The stranger's smile grew very broad, though it seemed to fill the room like an outburst of the sun, gleaming into a shadowy dell where the yellow autumn leaves. For so looked the lumps and particles of gold, lie strewn in the glow of light. The golden touch, exclaimed he. You certainly deserve credit, friend Midas, for striking out so brilliant of a conception. But are you quite sure this will satisfy you? How could it fail? Said Midas. And would you never regret the possession of it? What could induce me, asked Midas, I asked nothing else, to render me perfectly happy. Be it as you wish, then, replied the stranger, waving his hand in a token of farewell. Tomorrow, at sunrise, you will find yourself gifted with the golden touch. The figure of the stranger then became exceedingly bright, and Midas involuntarily closed his eyes. On opening them again, he beheld only one yellow sunbeam in the room, and all around him the glistening of the precious metal which he had spent his life in hoarding up. Whether Midas slept as usual the night, the story does not say, asleep or awake, or however. His mind was probably in the state of a child's, to whom a beautiful new plaything was promised in the morning. At any rate, Dead had hardly peeped over the hills when King Midas was broad awake, and stretching out his arms out of bed, began to touch the objects that were in his reach. He was anxious to prove whether the golden touch had really come according to the stranger's promise. So he laid a finger on the chair by the bedside and on various other things, but was grievously disappointed to perceive that they remained exactly the same substance as before. Indeed, he felt very much afraid that he had only dreamed about the illustrious stranger, or else that the latter had been making a game of him. And what a miserable affair would it be if, after all his hopes, Midas must content himself with that little gold he could scrape together by ordinary means, instead of creating it by touch. All this while it was only in the gray of the morning, with but a streak of brightness along the edge of the sky, where Midas could not see it. He lay in a very disconsolated mood, regretting the downfall of his hopes, and kept growing sadder and sadder until the early sunbeam shone through the window and gilded the ceiling over his head. It seemed to Midas that his bright yellow sunbeam was reflected in a rather singular way on the white covering of the bed. Looking more closely, what was his astonishment and delight, where he found that his linen fabric had been transmuted to what seemed the woven texture of the purest and brightest gold. The golden touch had come to him with the first sunbeam. Midas stood up in a kind of joyful, frenzied way and ran about the room, grasping at everything that happened to be his way. He seized one of the bedposts, and it became immediately fluttered golden pillar. He pulled aside a wooden curtain in order to admit a clear spectacle of the wonders which was performing, and the tassel grew heavy in his hand, a mass of gold. He took up a book from the table. At his first touch, it assumed the appearance of such a splendidly bound and edged volume as one often meets with nowadays. But on running his fingers through the leaves, behold, it was a bundle of thin golden plates, in which all the wisdom of the book had grown ineligible. He hurried, put on his clothes, and was enraptured to see himself in a magnificent suit of gold cloth, which retained its flexibility and softness. Although it burdened him a little with its weight, he drew out his handkerchief, which little Marigold had hemmed for him. That was likewise gold, with the dear child's neat, pretty stitches running along the border in gold thread. Somehow or another, this last transformation did not quite please King Midas. He would rather that his little daughter's handiwork should have remained just the same as she climbed his knee and put it into his hand. But it was not worthwhile to vex himself about a trifle. Midas now took his spectacle from his pocket and put them on his nose, in order that he might see more distinctly what he was about. In those days, spectacles for common people had not been invented, but were already worn by kings. Else, how could Midas have any? To this great perplexity, however, excellent as the glasses were, he discovered that he could not possibly see through them. That is the most natural thing in the world, for on taking them off, the transparent crystal turned out to be plates of yellow metal and, of course, were worthless as spectacles. Though valuable as gold, it struck Midas a rather inconvenient thought that all his wealth he could never be again to own a pair of serviceable spectacles. It is no great matter, nonetheless, said to himself, very philosophical. We cannot expect any great good without it being accompanied with some small inconvenience. The golden touch is worth the sacrifice of a pair of spectacles, at least, if not one's very own eyesight. My eyes will serve for ordinary purposes, and little Marigold will soon be old enough to read to me. Wise King Midas was so exalted by his good fortune that the palace seemed not sufficient spacious to contain him. He therefore went downstairs and smiled, observing the staircase that became a bar of burnished gold as his hand pressed over it in his descent. He lifted the door latch. It was brass only a moment ago, but golden when his fingers quitted it, and emerged into the garden. Here, as it happened, he found a great number of beautiful roses in full bloom, and others in all the stages of lovely bud and blossom. Very delicious was their fragrance in the morning breeze. Their delicate blush was one of the fairest sights in the world. So gentle, so modest, and so full of sweet tranquility did these roses seem to be. But Midas knew a way to make them far more precious, according to his way of thinking, than roses had ever been before. So he took great pains in going from bush to bush, and exercised his magic touch until every individual flower and bud, and even the worms at the heart of some of them, were changed to gold. By the time this good work was completed, King Midas was summoned to breakfast. As the morning air had given him an excellent appetite, he made haste back to the palace. What was usually the king's breakfast in the day of Midas, I really do not know. I cannot stop now to investigate. To the best of my belief, however, on this particular morning, the breakfast consisted of hot cakes, some nice little brook trout, roasted potato, fresh boiled eggs, and coffee for King Midas himself, and a bowl of bread and milk for his daughter Marigold. At all events, this is a breakfast fit to set before the king, and whether or not King Midas could not have had a better. Little Marigold had not yet made her appearance. Her father ordered her to be called, and seating himself at the table, awaited the child's coming in order to begin his own breakfast. To do Midas justice, he really loved his daughter, and loved her so much this morning on account of the good fortune which had befallen him. It was not a great while before he heard her coming along the passage crying bitterly. This circumstance surprised him, because Marigold was one of the cheerfulest little people whom you would see in a summer's day, and hardly shed a thimbleful of tears in a 12-month. When Midas heard her sobs, he determined to put little Marigold into better spirits by agreeable surprise. So, leaning across the table, he touched his daughter's bowl, which was a china one, with pretty figures all around it, and transmuted it to gleaming gold. Meanwhile, Mary got slowly and opened the door and showed herself with her apron at her eyes, still sobbing as her heart would break. How now, my little lady? Cried Midas. Pray, what is the matter with you this bright morning? Marigold, without taking the apron from her eyes, held out her hand in which one of the roses which Midas had so recently transmuted. Beautiful, exclaimed her father. And what is there that is magnificent golden rose to make you cry? Ah, dear father, answered the child, as while her sobs would let her. It is not beautiful, but the ugliest flower that ever grew. As soon as I dressed, I ran to the garden to gather some roses for you. But I know you like them and like them better when gathered by your little daughter. But, oh dear me, what do you think has happened? Such a misfortune. All the beautiful roses that smell so sweetly and had so many lovely blushes are all blighted and spoiled. They are quite yellow, as you can see them, and no longer have any fragrance. What has been the matter with them? Oh, my dear little girl, pray don't cry about it, said Midas, who was ashamed to confess that he himself had wrought the change which so greatly affected her. Sit down and eat your bread and milk. You will find it easy enough to exchange a golden rose like that, which will last hundreds of years, for ordinary one which wither in a day. I don't care for such roses, cried Marigold, tossing it away. It has no smell, and the hard petals prick my nose. The child now sat down at the table and was so occupied with her grief for the blighted roses that she did not notice the wonderful transmutation of her china bowl. Perhaps this was all for the better, for Marigold was accustomed to taking pleasure in looking at the queer figures, strange trees, and houses. They were painted over the circumference of the bowl, and these ornaments were now entirely lost in the yellow hue of the metal. Midas, meanwhile, had poured out a cup of coffee, and, as a matter of course, the coffee pot, or whatever metal it may have been when he took it up, was gold, and he set it down. He thought to himself, this was a rather extravagant style of splendor in a king of a simple habits. Two breakfasts off a service of gold, and he began to puzzle with the difficulty of keeping his treasures safe. The cupboard and the kitchen are no longer a secure place for deposit so valuable as golden bowls and coffee pots. Amid these thoughts, he lifted a spoonful of coffee to his lips. Sipping it, was astonished to perceive that the instant his lips touched the liquid, it became molten gold, and the next moment hardened into a lump. Ha! Exclaimed Midas, rather aghast. What is the matter, father? Asked Marigold, gazing at him with the tears still standing in her eyes. Nothing, child, nothing, said Midas. Eat your milk before it gets quite cold. He took one of the nice little troughs on his plate, and, by way of experiment, touched its tail with his finger. To his horror, it was immediately transmuted from a miry fried brook trout into a goldfish, though not one of those goldfishes where people often kept in glass bowls as ornaments for the parlor. No, it was really a metallic fish, and it looked like it had been cunningly made into the nicest goldsmith in the world. Its little bones were now golden wires, its fins and tail were thin plates of gold, and there were marks on the fork on it, all the delicate, frothy appearance of a nicely fried fish, exactly intimidated in metal. A very pretty piece of work, as you may suppose. Only King Midas, just at that moment, would much rather have a real trout in his dish than an elaborate and valuable imitation of one. I don't quite see, thought to himself, how am I to get any breakfast? He took one of the smoking hot cakes and scarcely broken it, when, to his cruel mortification, though, a moment before, it had been the whitest meat to some yellow hue of an Indian meal. To say the truth, it had really been a hot Indian cake. Midas would have prized it a good deal more than now he did, when the solidarity and increased weight made him too barely sensible that it was gold. Almost in despair, he helped himself to a boiled egg, which immediately underwent a change similar to those of the trout in the cake. The egg, indeed, might have been mistaken for one of those famous goose in the storybook, was in the habit of laying, but King Midas was the only goose that had anything to do with the matter. Well, this is quandary, thought he, leaning back in his chair and looking quite envious at little Marigold, who was now eating her bread and milk with great satisfaction. Such a costly breakfast before me, and nothing that could be eaten. Hoping that, by dint of great dispatch, he might avoid how it felt to be a considerable inconvenience, King Midas snatched a hot potato and attempted to cram it into his mouth and swallow in a hurry, but the golden touch was too nimble for him. He found his mouth full, not of a mealy potato, but of solid metal, which so burnt his tongue that he roared aloud, jumping up from the big table. He began to dance and stomp about the room, both with pain and affright. "Father, dear father," cried Marigold, who was a very affectionate child. "Pray, what is the matter? Have you burnt your tongue?" "Ah, dear child," groaned Midas, dolefully, "I don't know what has become of your poor father. And truly, my dear little folks, did you ever hear of such a pitiable case in all your lives? Here was literally the richest breakfast that could be set before a king, and its very richness made absolutely good for nothing. The poorest laborer sitting down, whose crust of bread and a cup of water was far better off than King Midas, whose delicate food was really worth its weight in gold. It was to be done already at breakfast. Midas was excessively hungry, where he could be less so by dinner time, and how ravenous would be his appetite for supper, which must undoubtedly consist of the same sort of dishes as those now before him. How many days, think you, would he survive a continuance of this rich fare? These reflections were so troubled wise King Midas that he began to doubt whether, or after all, which riches are one desirable thing in the world, or even the most desirable. But this was only a passing thought. So fascinated was Midas with the glitter of the yellow metal that he would still have refused to give up the golden touch for so paltry a consideration as breakfast. Just imagine what a price for one meal's victuals. It would have been the same as paying millions and millions of money, as that many millions more would take forever to reckon up for some fried trout, an egg, a potato, a hot cake, and a cup of coffee. It would be quite too dear, thought Midas. Nevertheless, so great was his hunger and the perplexity of his situation that he again groaned aloud. Our pretty Marigold could endure it no longer. She sat a moment, gazing at her father, and trying, with all the might of her little wits, to find out what was the matter with him. Then, with a sweet and sorrowful impulse to comfort him, she started from her chair, and, running to Midas, threw her arms affectionately about her knees. He bent down and kissed her. He felt that his little daughter's love was worth 1,000 times more than he gained by the golden touch. "My precious Marigold," cried he, but Marigold made no answer. What had he done? How fatal was the gift which the stranger bestowed? The moment the lips of Midas touched Marigold's forehead, a change had taken place. Her sweet, rosy face, so full of affection as it had been, assuming a glittering yellow color, with yellow teardrops congealing on her cheeks. Her beautiful brown ringlets took the same tint. Her soft and tender little form grew hard and inflexible within her father's encircling arms. Oh, terrible, terrible misfortune! The victim of his insatiable desire for wealth. Little Marigold was a human child no longer, but a golden statue. Yes, there she was, The questioning look of grief, pity, hardened into her face. It was the prettiest and most woeful sight that ever mortal saw. All the features and tokens of Marigold was there. Even the beloved little dimple remained on her golden chin. But the more perfect was the resemblance, the greater was the father's agony of beholding this golden image, which was all that was left of him of his daughter. It had been a favorite phrase of Midas whenever he felt particularly fond of the child, to say that she was worth her weight in gold. And now the phrase had become literally true. And now, at last, when it was too late, he felt how infinitely a warm and tender heart that loved them exceeded in value all the wealth that could be piled up between the earth and the sky. It would be too sad of a story if I were to tell you how Midas, in the fulfillment of all his gratified desires, began to wire in his hands and bemoan himself on how he could neither bear to look at Marigold nor yet look away from her, except when his eyes were fixed on the image. He could not possibly believe that she was changed to gold, but stealing another glance, there was that precious little figure with a yellow teardrop on his yellow cheek, and a look so piteous and tender that it seemed as if the very expression must needs soften gold, make it flesh again. This, however, could not be. So Midas had only to wire in his hands and to wish that he were the poorest man in the wide world. If the loss of all his wealth might bring back the faintest rose color to his dear child's face. While he was in despair, he suddenly beheld a stranger standing near the door. Midas bent down his head without speaking, for he recognized the same figure which had appeared to him the day before in the treasure room and had bestowed upon him this disastrous faculty of the golden touch. The stranger still wore a smile, which seemed to shed a yellow luster all about the room, and gleamed on little Marigold's image, and all the other objects that had been transmuted by the touch of Midas. "Well, friend Midas," said the stranger, "pray how do you succeed with the golden touch?" Midas shook his head. "I am very miserable," he said. "Very miserable indeed," exclaimed the stranger. "And how happens that? Have I not faithfully kept my promise with you? Have you not everything that your heart desired?" "Gold is not everything," said Midas, "and I have lost all that my heart really cared for." "Ah, so you made a discovery since yesterday," observed the stranger. "Let us see then. Which of these two things do you think is really worth the most? The gift, the golden touch, or 1 cup of cold, clear water?" "Oh, blessed water," exclaimed Midas. "It would never moisten my parched throat again." "The golden touch," continued the stranger, "or a crust of bread?" "A piece of bread," answered Midas, "is worth all the gold on earth." "The golden touch?" asked the stranger, "or your very own little Marigold, warm, soft, and loving as she was an hour ago?" "Oh, my child, my dear child," cried poor Midas, wringing his hands. "I would not have given that one small dimple in return the power of changing this whole big earth into a solid lump of gold." "You are wiser than you were, King Midas," said the stranger, looking seriously at him. "Your own heart, I perceive, has not been entirely changed from flesh to gold. Were it so, your case would indeed be desperate. But you appear to be still capable of understanding the most common things, such as lie within everybody's grasp, are more valuable than the riches which so many mortals sigh and struggle after. Tell me, now, do you sincerely desire to rid yourself of this golden touch?" "It is hateful to me," replied Midas. A fly settled on his nose, but immediately fell to the floor, for it, too, had become gold. Midas shuddered. "Golden," said the stranger, and plunge into the river that glides past the bottom of your garden. Take likewise a vase of the same water and sprinkle it over any object that you may desire to change back again from gold into its former substance. If you do this in earnest and sincerity, it may possibly repair the mischief which your avarice has occasionally caused. King Midas bowed low, and when he lifted his head, the illustrious stranger had vanished. You will easily believe that Midas lost no time in snatching up a great earthen pitcher, but alas, it was no longer earthen until he touched it, and hastening to the riverside, as he scampered along, forced his way through the shrubbery. It was positively marvelous to see how the foliage turned yellow behind him, as if autumn had been there, and nowhere else. On reaching the river's brink, he plunged headlong in, without waiting so much as to pull off his shoes. Poof, 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 snorted King Midas, as his head emerged from the water. Wow, this isn't really a refreshing bath. I think I must have washed it away with the golden touch, and now for filling my pitcher. As he dipped the pitcher into the water, it gladdened very hard to see it change from gold into the same good, honest earth vessel which had been before he touched it. He was conscious, also, changed within himself. A cold, hard, and heavy weight seemed to have gone out of his bosom. No doubt, his heart had been gradually losing its human substance and transmuting itself into insatiable metal, but had now softened back again into flesh. Perceiving a violet that grew on the bank of the river, Midas touched it with his fingers, and was overjoyed to find that the delicate flower retained its purple hue, instead of going into a yellow blight. The curse of the golden touch had therefore really been removed. King Midas hastened back to the palace, and I suppose the servants knew not what to make of it when they saw the royal master so carefully bringing home an earthen pitcher of water. But that water, which was to undo all the mischief that has folly his wrath, was more precious to Midas than the ocean of molten gold could have ever been. The first thing he did, as you need hardly be told, was to sprinkle it by handfuls over the golden figure of little Marigold. No sooner did it fall on her than you could have laughed to see how the rosy color came back to the dear child's cheek, and how she began to sneeze and sputter, and how astonished she was to find herself dripping wet. Her father still throwing more water over her. Pray do not fear, child. See how my whip, that rice frock which I put on this morning? For Marigold did not know that she had a little golden statue, nor could she remember anything that happened since the moment she ran with outstretched arms to comfort poor King Midas. Her father did not think it was necessary to tell his beloved child how very foolish he had been, but contented himself with showing how much wiser he had now grown. For this purpose, he had led little Marigold into the garden, where he sprinkled all the remaining water over the rose bushes with such good effort that about 5,000 roses recovered their beautiful bloom. There were two circumstances, however, which, as long as he lived, used to put King Midas in the mind of the golden touch. One was that the sands of the river sparkled like gold. The other, little Marigold's hair now had a golden tinge, which she had never observed in it before. She had been transmuted by the effect of his kiss. This change of hue was really an improvement. It made Marigold's hair richer than in her babyhood. When King Midas had grown quite an old man, and used to trot Marigold's children on his knee, he was fond of telling them this marvelous story, pretty much as I told it now to you. And it would stroke her glossy ringlets and tell them that their hair, likewise, had a rich shade of gold, which they inherited from their mother. And to tell you the truth, my precious little folks, quoth King Midas, trotting the children all the while, ever since that morning, I have hated the very sight of all other gold. And you have a good night. This is Bobby Rave. I